Hey guys.
How's it going? How's everyone?
Good.
Well, first, it's great to see you.
You too.
So, yeah, should we just jump into it? Yeah, just to begin, we kind of just want to see if you can just say a few words about kind of the inception of the project. And just your relationship to sound and how kind of sound kind of brought you to this film, to Black to Techno, to Detroit. What is the relationship that you have to the place, to the sound, and to the project?
For sure, yeah. So, Black to Techno is the fourth film from a series of films that were made for Gucci and Frieze, exploring the second summer of love. So it's like a celebration of the 30th anniversary of that. And so the series is kind of like looking at the various sound, electronic sounds that emerged out of that time. And so my film is the fourth iteration of that, which is looking at techno. And the perspective that I took is I'm looking at Detroit as the source and the space of innovation of the sound, and then also looking at Berlin as kind of like the center of the fandom of the sound. And in the film, which will premiere later on tonight, I'm taking more so an anthropological approach at looking at the film. And then I guess sonically, I'm looking at ideas of mimesis. So I'm looking at black folk at the turn of the 20th century and looking at sounds that were emerging out of that time, and looking at ideas of mimicry between movement and labor and sound. So what I do is I look at, for example, sharecroppers, and that's cut in a rhythmic fashion. And then the idea is, out of that, we were looking at the ideas of also the lineage of black sound and the lineage of black music. So early black sound, looking at, like, for example, jazz, the blues, and the sounds that were coming out of agriculture and stuff at that point. And then the film kind of takes you into looking at automation, engineering, and car manufacturing, and tries to make visual and sonic and musical links between movement within that space and the kind of sounds that would be born out of a space like that. So in a kind of nutshell, that's kind of it's kind of what it's all about.
I'm really interested. So I mean, we've talked about the film, you, Darol, and I, and the kind of richness that's born from thinking about what the working environment or just the larger social environment of a place like Detroit, how from that techno was born. But I'm really interested in your use of the word mimesis and mimicry. What do you mean by that?
Mimesis, so what it is, okay, so it's kind of interesting because there's an incredible academic by the name of Beth Coleman, and she has written books and articles on ideas of black bodies and technology. And I guess for me, within the film, sound, I'm looking at ideas of, there's something that without giving away too much, there's something we look at in the film where we're looking at the aspects of where music sits within, or music's relationship to our working relationship. So we look at ideas of techno, technique. And so we're looking at the ideas of the music being techno, and then the idea of this, or the ideas of the labor, or the ideas of the movement or the work being the technique, and how that rolls over into techno. So technique into techno. So I guess, like, on some level for me, like, I as a visual artist and just as a person, I'm constantly interested in looking at the totality of an environment as a means to understand why things will come out of that. So for me, techno is a resulting sound. So it's a sound that is resulting from the environment that it's created in, from the time that it's in, from the legacy or the history that it comes from. And so, like, in terms of, like, mimesis, if you really want to, like, get to something like really specific, like when I was shooting the film, I went to various car plants and went to various factories in Detroit with a location sound recorder. And so what we were doing before we would start shooting or like rolling is I would walk around like these factories and listen to the sounds that were being created, and then we would then record some of these sounds as well. And what was really interesting to me is when I was thinking about or listening to early techno records, so like from Underground Resistance, like Mike Banks, from the Belleville 3, from Juan Atkins, like all those cats, like you can hear this like built into the sounds of the music. And then also just thinking about legacies of Black sound, like I was looking at Detroit, the Motor City, as an incubator of like just a generation of like Black sound. So like looking at ideas of like Motown and like Berry Gordy, who literally ran Motown like a hit making factory, like, you know what I mean? Like, so trying to figure out what are all these links and how are they mimicking each other, but then also how are they speaking to each other, to kind of give a more overarching or more well-rounded sense of why this sound came out, why this sound happened when it happened. Like, I'm like, it could only be in the Midwest. Like, it could only be during Reagan America. It could only be like during the Cold War. Like, it could only be like because funk and Motown and jazz and the blues and bebop had happened before it, you know? Like, there were other things happening in the Midwest. So you're thinking about Chicago and like the warehouse, house music, you know, thinking about even like Ohio, you know, and thinking about like, even for me, like the Ohio Players or like Junie Morrison or like Bernie Worrell, like all these cats are like, they're all in this area, like, you know, so so just thinking about all those things as it means to understanding techno. And then also something that was really interesting to me as well is that, and I was speaking to an academic, Alexander Wahelier, and something that was interesting as well, oh God, I've lost my train of thought, what was I gonna say? It's gone. It'll
come back. It's gonna come back.
Yes. So we were talking about So we were talking about like the legacy of Black sound and how like techno definitely has a rooting in that legacy. Right. But what's interesting is because other sounds tend to have some form of vocal accompaniment to the music are able to situate themselves geographically in a space and then create a mainstay in a space like hip hop, right? You know, if you heard like LL Cool J, he was from New York at a certain period of time, but because techno is a instrumentally based sound, there's opportunity, or it provides space for people to find themselves within the sound and for it to move, which is why it can find an unlikely friendship in Berlin. And so I kind of called it like this alien alliance between Detroit and Berlin, because these are kids at one point in time who are looking for ideas of freedom. You know, there's like pre-fall of the Berlin Wall, right? And these kids are trying to find a sound that expresses their want for freedom or their ideas of their future. And, you know, it's interesting how you have, and also it's just interesting how like Germany is like this country of like engineers and like, you know, and is a country that is a car producing country. And then you have like Detroit, you know, as a city, like the Fordist capital of like America. Like it's just all these interesting like interlinks happening that I was kind of, sorry, I wasn't meant to go on for so long, but like all these, like, just like all these interesting things happening. So, yeah.
I think that beautifully kind of builds to the next question, just thinking about movement, right? And so like the movement of sound, but also thinking about movement in relationship to like Black folks, right? In the history of movement and our relationship to movement. I think that opens up that question. Yes. So I'm just curious if you would want to say a bit more about movement and how many expressive cultures move from Detroit, other places. So kind of that relationship.
Yeah. Wow, man. Movement. It's such a loaded thing. Like I can go in so many different ways. Because then I think about, so something else that we're looking into in the film is the mythology that was attached to the mythology that was created
Right.
from a group called Drexciya.
Yeah.
Right.
Who were I call like underground resistance. For me, they're like the techno Wu-Tang Clan.
Yeah.
Like, they're like the techno what like the Wu-Tang Clan is like the hip hop, right?
Yeah.
And so like Drexciya, like a group that came out of underground resistance, and they have this mythology about the Black Atlantis baby. So the whole idea is that when so think about movement on this level. So like when ships were going from West Africa to the Americas, like oftentimes pregnant women were thrown overboard, right? And so they have this mythology around the pregnant women that were thrown overboard, that the children of those pregnant women learn how to breathe within amniotic fluid and then eventually learn how to breathe underwater. And at the bottom of the sea is this land like called like Drexciya, where like everyone exists, right? So there's ideas of like movement like that we're looking at in the film. On a more grounded level, there's ideas of like the Detroit Jit, which is like a form of footwork from Detroit that tends to be done to techno. We look at that. Looking at ideas of, also thinking about this legacy and this lineage between from the turn of the last century to now. Looking at, talking about like the Great Migration.
Right.
Talking about ideas of the Black Bottom as well in Detroit. Where the land was so rich. And then, God, let me think, what else do we have around movement? And then also just the movement from Detroit to Berlin.
Exactly.
So I guess like thinking about movement like really dynamically within the piece in those areas.
Yeah. I don't know, it just gets me thinking about irony on just sort of the irony of Black life in many ways. Isn't it ironic that out of, you know, the Middle Passage, Black people are turning to life? You know, the myth of Drexciya is that the babies, you know, is that the babies, the unborn children, you know, are learning how to breathe underwater, or the irony that out of Black cultural production came the music that sort of empowered a largely white German citizenry to call for peace and the reunification of East and West. But, you know, and it's sort of another point of irony for me is thinking about Arthur Jafa's dub structure.
Right.
And so, again, you know, such strong Black cultural production is coming out of thinking of loss, thinking of rupture, thinking about dealing, sort of, you know, coming to terms with trauma. Yeah, those ironies just ring really, they resonate with me, but they also, yeah,
it's interesting because it's like AJ's whole like AJ's whole thoughts around the ideas of the missing. So basically what, you know, I guess on some level what that is looking at is ideas of loss and how we're reconciling those ideas of loss. So the idea essentially that when you hear the dropout in any form of like Black musical composition, it's to do with ideas of the missing. So it's to do with ideas of how to, it accounts for things that cannot be recovered.
Right.
That's what the dropout accounts for. So like if you're listening to like dub music and it's like everything's going and then it falls like that do 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 do. That like that accounts for that. Or like he was talking about like, or in jazz when it's like the hi-hat going, that accounts for that. Or like in techno when it's like, it's just like the 4/4, like just going, it accounts for that. And then I think he even linked it back to, and which was really interesting because then he then links it back to German dub techno, and he links that the idea of the missing there to the pre-fall of the wall and the Holocaust of the Jewish community in Germany. Like that's what the dropout represents, or he states that's what the dropout represents in that context. So.
Yeah, I mean, that was our own dropout. But to add on, I'm thinking saying a few words. Earlier in the discussion, you mentioned like having this anthropological approach, and we got bits and pieces of that, but wanted you to give you space to elaborate on kind of the method behind the approach and method to approach this specific project.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a fitting method, but I just think maybe it's my method
Right.
or my interest. You know, I guess for me, like I'm just, again, like as I said before, like it's a resulting sound. So I'm very curious to find out like why a sound. Like I have question. Like my films are just, I aim to raise questions
Right.
instead of like create singular answers. Like I think that's just propaganda, right?
Right.
Like you must feel this once you
Right.
watch this film. It's more so it's just like to create space for questions. I've lost my train of thought again.
It being your method, it being your
Yeah, so
approach.
anthropology.
Right.
So I'm interested. So for me, it was very much, there were certain conversations I was having with people in Detroit and and also like, you know, there's always written histories and then unwritten
Right,
like histories,
right.
right? And so like these conversations that I was just having with different people, like for example, like, you know, Detroit is a black hair capital, like one of the black hair capitals like of the world. And it was like this funny analogy that how like people who were always into nightclubbing and techno were always into hair. So just interesting like things, like the idea that there were salons that were open 24/7,
Yeah.
and you could go to a techno party at like the Music
And
Institute,
then
leave the
get the
techno
touch up.
party, then get your Jericho, your fade,
Yeah.
your flip, your bob, your weave, whatever,
Right.
touched up, and then go to work. Like stuff like that. For me, I'm just like, unless you're from there, or unless someone puts this on wax, like who's gonna know? Like these things are happening. So it's very interested in things like that. What else do we have? I'm so close to it, guys, so forgive me. Like, I've been sitting with it for a while, so I'm very in my head with it. So I'm trying to make sure that I'm being somewhat clear. We have, what else do we have I can talk to you about? I guess I'm also interested, like beyond, and I mentioned legacy of black sound, but also beyond techno. Detroit, like there's so many musical heroes from Detroit that I was like, the idea of that all these individuals, all these sounds will be, you know, disparate is like, it's just like, it's not. So it's very interesting, how do I like create those, so create those links. So like, you know, there's like an ode to Jay Dilla in the film, and it's, you know, you have Greg Tate talking about like how, you know, and some of the backstory of what he's talking about is the fact that like a sound like techno was created in Detroit, and it was a space of innovation and creation, but then its lifeblood, or like its fandom, was in Berlin. But what ends up happening is that you have musical geniuses like Jay Dilla in Detroit who were around that environment and adopted that into hip hop, you know, and then like thinking about his legacy, or like thinking about the legacy of Aretha Franklin and C.L. Franklin and New Bethune Church in Detroit, and what that means, and just like how all these artists, like it's so interesting, like how all these artists are just linked to, again, automation and literally to create the Motor City sound. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you got it.
Well, I think it's fascinating. So you mentioned kind of how this like disparate areas, right? And it's fascinating how that is in a discussion about a resulting sound, but then also how it matches in the form, right? And I think that's an important kind of decision to make, and kind of matching the form with the content, right? And so that was kind of what I was thinking when I asked the question about the anthropological approach. So just kind of wanting to see Was that something, how we talk about Mimesis, was it something that happened in the making of it? That as you were doing it, it's like, this is, this is the method, right? And how that mirrors even the object, the people that you're studying, that you're interested in, the topic in and of itself, and how that happens, you're mirroring the content.
Yeah, I mean, as an artist, like I'm very interested, and I always talk about like interested in creating cinema as opposed to creating film, and like I feel like for me, film deals more so with ideas of representation, whereas cinema takes it one step forward and bakes in ideas of representation and also different languages of doing things into the form of the film. So I guess like in terms of process and in terms of the construction of the filmic language that I want to create, or like for example created here, I'm very much trying to get on a more deeper level, closer to what it is I'm exploring, like not just by telling you, but also by baking that into how this story unfolds, and like what am I doing in terms of the edit? How is this being cut? Like, are there ideas of, Mimesis in the way it's being cut? You know, what are these connections? For example, like there's like, I worked with a sound designer, and we were thinking about like, it's that whole thing of like, I really respect film as a visual medium. So I try to, my big thing is like show, don't tell, So I think even structurally when I was doing this edit with my editor, we kind of took a phasal approach to everything, whereby like we created the edit without any voices from anyone. So the idea was for us, we need to be able to read this film by just hearing the sounds and watching it without any voice, like any interruptions. And then if it can read like that, and if you can feel techno like that, then we add the voices on top just to kind of give you the information on some level that you can't communicate like visually. So that's something that's like super, super important to me in my works. Is I'm constantly looking for how to push ideas of film language within cinema, and how do we create cinema, or how do we create pieces that essentially are not just, I find like talking heads really boring as well. like, so this is techno and it was born in 1981. Like, I'm just interested, I want to see that, and I want the audience to feel like, to have an experiential relationship to the work, and I want you to feel like you've almost gone into a realm of this space. Like, I want you to be inside of it, not just looking at it. Like, I want you to be active within it. Like, it's a call and response, essentially. So that's something I'm constantly thinking about in terms of structure, or in terms of even anthropologically, like as you mentioned, like, some of the contributors, for example, we called each other, or I said, hey, like, here's what we're looking at. You have your moment, and like, do a recording of yourself. So everything feels quite, it almost feels found, And like the way I've kind of described the language for this particular film is almost like it feels like the watching pattern on a Friday night of a Detroiter looking at public access TV, where there's this huge like constellation of like just techno, different aspects of techno, and they're just switching between these different channels, So on some level that was that language of that level.
One thing, so we mentioned Alexander Ohelier, and one thing in his book Phonographies that I find really interesting is he kind of articulates the disembodied voice delivered via a phonograph as sort of a manifestation of Black modernity, essentially. And so the key part of that is voice, and we sort of talked about how the absence of voice is why sort of techno hasn't been located in the way that it has, why, You know, when I was in 8th grade, learning German. I don't know why we were learning German instead of Spanish. But when we were, and then like, and I thought techno was German. Like I thought it was German. I thought that's where it started. But in any case, I'm wondering in the absence of the voice in techno, sort of how techno then specifically manifests sonic Afro-modernity. How do you think it does that?
I think it is to do with, okay, I'll answer that, but I want to go somewhere real quick first. It also has to do with ideas and relationships between like the ideas of like man and the machine.
Right.
So like, and ideas of transference. So like, for example, like techno artists like Derek May will say like, you know, like the philosopher Adorno will say that the ideas of the machinization of like humanity leads us to be more distant away from each other. But someone like Derek May will say, actually, no, it does the complete opposite. And what it is a form of spiritual transference. Yeah. So like, so it's, how do I say, like the drum machine, for example, the 909 or the 808, excuse me, my bad. The 909 or like the 808 drum machine is being used to transfer that energy. Now, I really believe in, I'm constantly, in all areas, constantly talking about ideas of feeling. And I think that it is, I want to say cosmic, but like it's, I think what becomes interesting again is like if we go back to looking at the fact that how this sound transferred from one particular group's ideas of or explorations of futurism and ideas of freedom to another group's understandings of futurism and ideas of freedom. And it's a very unlikely group to find itself in. The fact that that was able to do that across like continents. I don't know, I feel for me that I wish I had the better language to describe how I want to express myself. But it's ideas. I feel like it's just it's baked into the spirit of the sound. The spirit is baked into the sound, you know. There's a reason why people are connecting to it. It's not something that obviously is tangible, but it's present nonetheless, you know. And I, you know, like I did like a podcast for the film with Matthew, and I was talking about like how, you know, even like in music, the fact that, you know, it's that saying like from Maya Angelou where people will forget what you said, what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Like that idea of feeling, like I feel like it's in the work in the same way like when you listen to jazz, like it's in there, you know, like you feel it. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, that's what I'm thinking of like most immediately when you mention that.
I immediately think about kind of, you know, you brought it up earlier about like the relationship between like labor and movement, right? And the role of sound. Specific to Detroit, right? And the tension and just kind of the feeling that was present thinking about labor, right? And how that's transferred to the movement. And so then seeing those lines, those connecting threads to techno, right? And how techno is experienced like by the people, right? And then how that kind of spreads out and manifests itself through different, you know, cultural moments, right? And different expressive acts by the folks in Detroit. And how that moves in and of itself, right? So this continually thinking about kind of automation, but then also thinking about transference as well in relationship to labor, intention, and trying to hold all these things together to maybe say something about modernity, but also to say something about kind of the spirit of the people, because I feel like as we're talking and as we're speaking and coming, for me, it was me learning more about techno, right? And kind of the unseen voices, the unseen people involved in kind of putting this on the map, right? And then, so this is a long way to ask a question about public access, right? This is a long way to ask about kind of, can you remind me of Mojo? I'm thinking of the Electrifying Mojo. So, but it's a constellation of people and names that we might not know. And you think of techno, right? Like you said, you thought, Berlin. So kind of how there's that absence present that we were talking about earlier, that's present with like the Dropout and stuff like that. And just maybe talking a bit about folks who are maybe unknown in certain circles in and around techno, who are very influential in its development, specific to Detroit.
Yeah, I think the number one person then is exactly who you brought up, is the Electrifying Mojo. So the Electrifying Mojo is and was a Detroit DJ who had a radio show called the Midnight Funk Association. And the Midnight Funk Association was essentially, he would literally land a mothership in Detroit every night. And every member of the Midnight Funk Association had a membership card. And he would always do this call to the members of the Midnight Funk Association at the beginning of every show. And he would be like, flash your lights, like honk your horns, like whatever, like we're about to take off. And I think what's really particular about him and what he was doing is that he was, and to mention that, Detroit had its birthplace in Detroit is not to defeat, the fact that Kraftwerk, were doing their thing in Germany, in the late 60s into the early 70s as well. And so what was interesting about him was that he was playing tracks from like Depeche Mode, like next to Prince, like next to Kraftwerk, like next to Motown artists. So like you have like these kids in Detroit, unlike maybe other cities around, in the United States, who had this very kind of casual, I want to say, like relationship to sounds, to various sounds. And so I feel like even the presence of someone like Mojo, like in Detroit, and with like having like young like ears who were like into like hearing brand new sounds, the fact that these kids like at a very young age were listening to like Depeche Mode and Prince and Stevie and Kraftwerk and like all these other European artists, I feel like is what led to the sound also being almost sounding somewhat hybrid, in a way. Even before techno was called techno, like a lot of these cats were describing it as progressive music. Or one of the very first terms for it was high tech soul. So there was like ideas of like funk and like soul music, but it was like a technologically driven version of the sound. I think even Derek May describes it as he says it's an intellectual sound, and like it's a sound that although you had these kids like listening like religiously like to the Electrifying Mojo, it wasn't a sound like Keeping It 100 that was celebrated when it was created. Right. I mean, now obviously everyone from Detroit, we celebrate techno, but at the time when it was created, it feels very much to me like what was happening like where I'm from in like London with grime. Everyone was like, it's a form of punk music on some level. It's a punk sound. Right. Like these are like sounds of resistance, essentially, and so it was super lo-fi as well. These are not like, you have to like think about the fact that like people's ears were adjusted to a very saccharine Motown like sound, and here you have these kids like making like music on like new age drum machines, and it's super lo-fi, and it's like they're playing it in industrial spaces. Like we've got to wrap up. Okay, playing it industrial. Playing these sounds in all these like desolate, like industrial, like spaces. It was very underground,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah,
I hate to interject.
so a good place to
Go
wrap
on,
up.
but I know that some people want to ask questions. I just want to make
Yeah.
some
Oh, yeah,
time
yeah,
for
yeah.
Absolutely.
here.
Absolutely.
And I thought while we're talking about the lo-fi, I can go back to not using it. But we do have a mic somewhere, so if anybody does have a question, we can roll it to if someone wants to raise their hand. Yeah, absolutely. I'll see if I can find the mic. No, we'll stay with the mic.
So I'm actually, by the way, great talk. Congratulations on the film. It's
Thank
dope.
you.
I think I'm curious because I actually expected to hear about the Black experience of techno, as if techno was here and Black people were like over here experiencing it. So I'm kind of floored by it. I love this.
Yeah.
So when you think about the original sounds of like techno, like going way back, like, what does that even like sound like?
Yeah.
Cybertron clear.
I mean, you talk about like funk and
Yeah.
like I think about
Yeah.
funk is over here and techno is like in like
I know.
over there.
Right.
So it's like how? So what is it? So if it's how can you even describe what that sounded like?
Man, but okay, so also something we didn't get to mention, there used to be like a public access show called The
Right.
New Dance
Right.
Show, which was like a local TV show which felt very much like Soul Train, but for Detroit. And like kids will come into the studio and they play techno music, and you see all these Black kids like just dancing like like techno, and it was shown on TV. It was called The New Dance Show. So early like techno sounds to me, just on a personal like level, to me sound like a development of funk and soul. And some can even feel quite, to be fair, like just feel quite jazzy as well. Like there's influences of like jazz in there. But then also like the influence of, like we're talking about Mimesis as well, like influences of that like factory sound. So maybe there's an exchange of like, I don't know, maybe there's an exchange of like a bass line to something that's a little bit more like harder and colder, you know?
Do you think it's
Staccato. It's definitely funky, but there's a staccato-ness to it as well. Trying to think what else. Yeah, are you coming to see the film tonight?
I'm gonna after this.
You gotta come. Like, yeah.
I thought the
You
film
should.
was now and the top pack was 7 later, so I'm gonna.
Are you coming to
make
the
it
film?
work.
Okay, please. 7:30
Yeah.
on the Paramount. Yeah. On this one. Yeah.
We're screening
On
it
site.
on Sunday
Yes.
with the rest
Thank
of
you,
the
Matthew.
series.
Yes.
And is it available online as well for Gucci, or how is it being streamed later, or how is?
So firstly, we're showing it here today, and then we're showing it again on Sunday.
Yeah.
Sunday 17th, 3:30, right? Yeah, so we're going to show all 4 films, like the whole series of the Second Summer of Love. And then after that, just kind of like stay peeled to Frieze's channels, Gucci's channels, my channels, and you'll hear where it goes
Right.
next. Yeah,
Beautiful.
yeah. You're welcome.
Maybe on that note of anticipation, I'm sure if the
Yeah.
speakers have time to mingle, then maybe there'll be more questions.
Yeah.
Especially here. He says, you never forget how someone makes you feel. I think we feel extremely grateful to join me in thanking